Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says ECI cannot be a super government. Elections is a festival of the democracy. Who are the major stakeholders involved? We have the political parties and their candidates, people exercising their political right by casting their vote, and who makes it successful? It is the Election Commission of India. We know from the fact that the Election Commission of India is a constitutional body. It superintends, directs, and controls the control of the elections when it comes to India. So, this article here is critically evaluating the role of the Election Commission of India when it comes to the execution of the free and fair elections. Let's try and understand what is the author trying to convey. When it comes to the powers of the Election Commission of India, there are two phases that we can describe them. One is what is called as the pre 1990 era, the other is after 1990 era. What exactly happened? Before 1990, we did not have election commissioners like T.N. Seshan, and after 1990, we have had election commissioners who have repeatedly ensured that there's free and fair election, that which is supported, espoused, and implemented when it comes to the elections in India. So before 1990, we did not have the strict enforcement of the election commission rules and regulations, but after 1990, with the precedent set by T.N. Seshan as the chief election commissioner, there have been n number of electoral reforms that which has been taking place after 1990. What are the major reforms that was taken by T.N. Seshan, who happened to be the chief election commissioner in the year 1990? What we have to look at is number of steps initiated by the chief election commissioner. What are these steps? He knew for the fact that the Election Commission of India had all the powers that it was given under the Article 324 of the Constitution of India. So what does he do? He immediately starts enforcing the Model Code of Conduct. This was supposed to be irritating the political parties. Why? Because until then, we did not have the strict election commissioners who were implementing the Model Code of Conduct, but with the precedent set by T.N. Seshan, the political parties got irritated. Until then, the political parties were able to rig the elections, they were able to put bogus votes as well, but with the Chief Election Commissioner T.N. Seshan in power, the rigged elections was completely done away with, the bogus voting was completely done away with, and in order to control the goons and the ruckus that was being created in all the election booths, we were also employing the central police forces. These were the major electoral reforms that took place after 1990, where we had T.N. Seshan as the chief election commissioner. These were the number of steps that were taken, and in order to give boost to this particular aspect, in order to espouse this very thought supported by T.N. Seshan, we have one of the landmark judgments given by the Supreme Court of India in Mahendra Singh Gill versus the Chief Election Commissioner. What did this judgment say about the powers of the Election Commission of India? It says that Article 324 contains plenary powers to ensure free and fair elections. What do we mean by it? When we speak about plenary powers, what are these powers? These are the absolute powers. What are these absolute powers? Let's say for the conduction of the free and fair election, all the powers that can be taken up by the Election Commission of India can be taken up by the Election Commission to ensure that there is free and fair election. Whether it is about legislative function, whether it is about chief judicial function, or it is about administrative function. So irrespective of what functions can be associated with the Election Commission of India, they can be given such plenary powers, that is the absolute powers, so that free and fair elections can be taken up, said the Supreme Court of India in Mahendra Singh Gill versus the Chief Election Commissioner. It is because of this judgment that happened in the 1970s and the 18th by number of precedents set by the Supreme Court. We have T.N. Seshan, who as the Chief Election Commissioner was able to bring massive reforms when it comes to the Election Commission. However, this article critically evaluates the role of the Election Commission of India and tries to understand if the Election Commission of India has so much of power to actually bring all these practices. First up, the author takes into picture what is called as the Model Code of Conduct. What is this Model Code of Conduct? This is the consensus among the political parties. When did it come into picture? This came in the picture back in the year 1960. It was first implemented in the state of Kerala. So what exactly happened? This was a political consensus that all political parties came together. This does not have a law. There is no statutory backing. What this means is, let's say there is BJP, let's say there is Congress, or let's say there are state parties as well. All these parties in a particular state, let's say in the state of Kerala, where you also have the LDF as well. So what do? They all came together. They entered into an understanding that we, the political parties, will have to ensure that these responsibilities have to be taken up by the political parties. These are the things that have to be met by the political parties. So irrespective of who is in power, they will not misuse the power where some of the consensus that all these political parties entered into. So kindly remember, this does not have a statutory backing. This does not have any law, but instead it is a code where all political parties came together, built them on a consensus, built them on an understanding between all the political parties. After it was implemented in the state of Kerala, it was also taken at the national level. So when it comes to the Model Code of Conduct, the author here says this does not have any backing. In fact, there was a committee that was appointed way back in the parliament, which also recommended that this particular Model Code of Conduct was to be implemented or should be added as part of the Representation of the People's Act of 1951. But the Election Commission of India was against this. Why? Let's say if we bring the Model Code of Conduct into this particular law, if it is brought into this particular law, what would happen? There would be political parties which would head to the court of law, and if they head to the court of law, the judgment will be delayed, and when the judgment is delayed, the elections and its processes could become a problem. The Election Commission of India was prospectively thinking about all these things, and ultimately it said that this idea of Model Code of Conduct need not be implemented in the Representations of the People's Act of 1951, basically to ensure that there are no court cases in the court of law which eventually delays this whole process of election. That is why the Election Commission of India did not want the Model Code of Conduct to be introduced in so-called Representation of the People's Act. But that is where the author also brings into a picture one of the important paragraphs of the Election Symbols Reservation Allotment Order of 1968. According to this order, it says that in case there is a political party, if this political party has been recognized by the Election Commission of India, if they do not follow what is called as the Model Code of Conduct, in such a situation, the Election Commission of India would be able to suspend or withdraw recognition of a recognized political party. So the author is now trying to ask a question to the Election Commission of India and in general, because the Model Code of Conduct is not a statutory provision, because the Model Code of Conduct is not present in the Representation of the People's Act of 1951, how is that the Election Commission of India can suspend or even withdraw the recognition for a recognized political party? Does it not mean it is ultra vires its power? Does it not mean it is superseding its power? Does it not mean since there is no statutory backing allotted to this particular law or what is called as the code, does it not mean that the Election Commission of India is superseding its powers? So this happens to be the first question that the author is trying to convey. Next, the author brings into picture what is called as the transfer of the officials. Let's say, for example, there is elections that is taking place in West Bengal, or let's say there are elections that are taking place in number of states like Kerala or at the national level as well. What do the Election Commission of India do? It has what is called as the observers for the Election Commission of India. What do? They also give a report to the Election Commission of India. On the basis of this report given by the observers of the Election Commission of India, it decides whether a particular official and administrative personnel has to be transferred from one state to another, or from a particular district to another district, or from a particular place to another. Why? Because if there is presence of that administrative personnel or that officer in that particular region, there might be adverse effect which might be resulting in not so having free and fair election in that state. So what is the power that the Election Commission has? The Election Commission, in order to make sure that there is free and fair elections, can transfer the officials. This is where the author also brings into perspective two important ideas. Does Article 324 of the Indian Constitution, does it give the power to the Election Commission of India to transfer an official? The author says no. Does the Model Code of Conduct give any idea, or does it have a particular rule or a section which allows the Election Commission of India to transfer an official? Again, no. Why? Because the Model Code of Conduct speaks about the conduct of the political parties. When it speaks about Article 324, Article 324 does not speak about the transfer of officials. This is where the Election Commission of India is superseding its power, says the author. How does the author substantiate it? When it comes to the transferring of the officials, who has the power? It is the executive of the respective state governments. So who can transfer an official? It is the state government and its executive government. Apart from this, the Supreme Court of India in the same Mohindra Gill's case has also said, if there is a particular law that is already in place for the Election Commission, then it can look into that particular law. If there is no other law, then the Election Commission can look into 324. But if there is a law, if there is an article, then the Election Commission will have to look into that particular law and that particular article of the Constitution for exercising its mandate. Now, when we speak about the transfer of the officials, we have one of the article called as Article 309 of the Constitution, which speaks about transfers when it comes to the All India services. Now, the question that the author is trying to say, when it is clearly given in Article 309, where this is about the transfer provisions with respect to the officials, it can only be done by the state government, and in cases it might also be the central government. And how is that the Election Commission of India is taking this power on itself by transferring the officials is the second concern voiced by the author. So the second concern is that the author says that the Election Commission of India should have limited powers when it comes to the transfer of the officials, says the author. The third major concern voiced by the author is in reference to the administrative moves. What are these administrative moves? Let's say, for example, we have one of the political parties. This political party has been given a mandate by the people so that they would be able to govern the country or a particular state. So what does this particular government which is elected do? What do? They make promises of the construction of roads, provision of drinking water facilities, etc., so on and so forth. But according to Election Commission of India, they are not supposed to make any of these promises when the Model Code of Conduct is implemented, which means to say that when the Model Code of Conduct is in place, the government should not do or take up any of the welfare schemes, says the Model Code of Conduct. Recently, we take the example of Government of Kerala. Government of Kerala was issuing kits which contained rice, pulses and cooking oil. In this particular backdrop, there were opposition political parties which opposed this particular move. They took it to the Election Commission of India, and the Election Commission of India asked the government of Kerala to suspend all these kits. This is where the author brings into picture some of the concerns. What are these concerns? We are living amidst the COVID-19. It also means the government becomes the major stakeholder to take care of its people. As the responsibility of the government, it was providing these kits from the past 1 year. So why is it wrong to provide welfare schemes to the people is the question that the author is trying to say. In fact, we have the Supreme Court of India in Subramaniam Balaji versus the government of Tamil Nadu and others in 2013, which had clearly said that for a welfare scheme to be executed where this political mandate has been given by the people to that political party, it is no wrong for that political party to execute the welfare schemes as it is part of the directive principles of state policy. Taking this judgment into picture, this whole idea of stopping one of the welfare schemes that is being executed is wrong, says the author. This is where the author also brings into picture section 123(2) of B of the Representation of the People's Act of 1951. According to this particular Representation of the People's Act, it clearly says that if there is a public policy or exercise of a legal right, this will not be regarded as interfering with the free exercise of the electoral right, since a government was trying to bring into picture one of the welfare schemes for the people of Kerala. How is it wrong? Asks the author in this particular case. Looking at all these concerns and points as we have just discussed, the author goes on to say that broad powers have been given to the Election Commission of India. Yes, these powers are required for the free and fair elections, but in those areas which is confusing, where there is a lot of dilemma, where there is a gray area, in such cases, clear rules and mandate will have to be given to the Election Commission of India, says the author. This is where the author brings into picture one of the beautiful statements made by Justice S.M. Fazal Ali in A.S. Jose versus Shivan Pillai. He says, if the Election Commission is armed with such unlimited and arbitrary powers, if it ever happens that persons manning the commission shares or is wedded to a particular ideology, he could, by giving odd directions, cause a political havoc or bring about a constitutional crisis, setting at naught the integrity and independence of the electoral process, so important and indispensable to the democratic system. We have to understand that the checks and balances will have to be managed going forward, is what is this article all about. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says an obituary for the IP Appellate Board. The article here speaks about the shutting down the Intellectual Property Appellate Board. Before we understand what this article is, we did discuss in our last week's CNA about the President of India signing the Tribunal Reforms Rationalization and Conditions of Service Ordinance 2021. According to this ordinance, the President of India had given the permission to the Government of India to shut number of appellate tribunals. One of the appellate tribunals that will be shut with this ordinance is the Intellectual Property Appellate Board. In this particular backdrop, let's try and understand what were the functions of this appellate board and what is the way forward with respect to the functions of this particular board and how it will be transferred to the High Court. First up, we have to understand the creation of this particular board. It was created or originally set up under the Trademarks Act of 1999. What were the functions of this Intellectual Property Appellate Board? Let's say, for example, there is one of the decisions that is passed by the Intellectual Property Office. Then there is an organization or an individual which is not happy with this particular decision, so they head to this appellate tribunal for relooking into this particular decision. So appeals from the Intellectual Property Office was going directly to the Intellectual Property Appellate Board in case of any conflict between the party and the authority. Then rectification or revocation of the applications was also heading to the Intellectual Property Appellate Board, or let's say, for example, they had to resolve appeals against the decisions of the controller of the patents, again that was going to the Intellectual Property Appellate Board, or they had to hear appeals against the trademark registry, that was once again going to the Intellectual Property Appellate Board. So the decisions given by one of the officers, if they were not happy with it, they used to go to the IPAB and it was acting as an appellate body. This particular body will now be shut and all the cases that are present with this appellate board in the near future will be heard by the High Court, is what is the gist or the introduction to this particular topic. The author here now tries to decipher the past of the intellectual property appellate board. When you look into this particular body, what was the functioning of this particular body? We have just discussed, but there are various concerns with respect to its operations. What are these various concerns? Ever since its inception, public opinion has been divided about the usefulness of this particular appellate board. Why? Because this was created in a haste, and its organization was in a haste, the management was in a haste, and it was abruptly ended. So even that ending is in a haste, says the author. So what does the author say? When it comes to the full implementation of this particular board, or the functions that it was supposed to execute, it was not happening in full scale. That is because of the vacancy issue. In this particular operations, what one requires is the staff, what one requires is the funding. Both when it comes to the staffing and when it comes to the funding were not good, and they were not applied judiciously, they were not applied on equality basis, which is why it resulted in vacancy of the intellectual property appellate board's staff as well as funding is the first major issue. Apart from this, the second major issue is with respect to the quorum. What is the quorum? It is the minimum number that is required for them to pass a decision against a particular body. The minimum quorum that is required is one judicial member and one technical member. Who is this technical member? A judicial member will be from the judiciary, and a technical member will be that person who has a fair bit of an idea or an expertise, who has worked in that particular domain, let's say patent, trademark or copyright, for about 5 years. So these two members will have to be present when a particular decision is being made by this intellectual property appellate board. But what is the major concern right now? There were issues with respect to the quality of the technical members. There have been instances where these technical members have also submitted incorrect information, and such members have also become part of the intellectual property appellate board. So the concern here is not only with respect to the understaffing or the funding, and it was also about the expertise as well, since the expertise that was present was not meeting the actual standards, which is why the shutting of this particular institute is right, says the author. Let's look into some of the statistics. When you look into the first decade of the operation of the patents bench, it saw a parity disposal rate of about 20 patent cases a year. Further, nearly 70% of the patent cases filed were either pending at some stage or yet to be taken up by hearing. After the IPAB was set up, not more than 15 cases were transferred from all the high courts to the IPAB, which means to say the original intention of establishing the IPAB was to ensure fast or the speedy disposal of the cases. Both was not being accomplished. One, the court cases were still being going to the high courts of every respective states, and it was also going to the Supreme Court as well, and at the same time the disposal rate when it comes to the IPAB was also abysmal and poor in nature, which is why the author says shutting of this particular institute was good idea taken up by the government of India. In any case, since the disposal rate for the patents at the IPAB did not justify its continuance, shutting this organization was no loss, says the authors. So what is that we have to understand? Earlier, we did set up the IPAB, and at the same time, we did have the number of judgments given by the Supreme Court of India, both with respect to the patents, copyright, trademark, so on and so forth. So the author here says that India missed a golden opportunity to create an area of jurisprudence. What is this jurisprudence? Let me give you an example. Jurisprudence is nothing but knowledge of law. Let's say, for example, we are speaking about property rights. What we have is the Transfer of Property Act, or let's say, for example, we speak about contract. So what we have is the contract law, or let's say, for example, we are speaking about the criminal laws. So what are these jurisprudence does is it gives a clear idea about why a law is required, for what a law is required, what are the objectives of this particular law, what are the precedents set by this particular law. So all this was supposed to be executed by the Supreme Court when it comes to the trademark or the patents. But unfortunately, with the intellectual property appellate board, it was in existence for the number of years. There could have been a jurisprudence study or a precedent that could have been set by the Intellectual Property Appellate Board or even by the Supreme Court with respect to these patents, trademarks, copyright, so on and so forth. But in the last few years, we have missed on this opportunity to understand deep and delve deep into this particular area, says the author. So the IPAB and the Supreme Court had the opportunity to ensure that we had a separate jurisprudence law knowledge with respect to the patents, copyrights, trademarks, so on and so forth. But we have missed on the golden opportunity of coming up with this in-depth knowledge and precedence, says the author. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says normal is good. What is the context? The southwest monsoon rainfall over India is most likely to be normal, says the Indian Meteorological Department. In this particular backdrop, we have to understand what is the criteria fixed by the Indian Meteorological Department and how is that it accomplishes its task of giving this particular designation of normal rainfall. First up, we have to understand one of the definitions called as the long period average. What is this long period average? Let's say, for example, the average rainfall that a country has seen for the past few years will be considered, and that past few years average from the year 1961 to 2020 for India will be considered, and its average is about 880 mm of rainfall for the southwest monsoon. If there is a particular rainfall that is predicted, and if the rainfall does happen, the precipitation does occur, and it is close by to 96 to 104% of the 88 centimeters, that is when it is called as the normal rainfall. So what is this normal rainfall? What the IMD or the Indian Meteorological Department does, it takes the average rainfall for over 50-year period. This average rainfall is currently about 880 mm. So if there is a rainfall in the next year or in the past, what the IMM checks is if it is meeting close by to this 880 mm of rainfall, if it is meeting a target of 96% or close by to 104% of this particular number, that is when it will be assumed as a normal rainfall. It will be called as above normal if it is between 104 to 10% of this average. It will be called as below normal if it is 90 to 96% of this average, and it will be called as deficient or drought if it is below 90% of this particular average. How did the IMD say that 2021 will have normal rainfall? That is because it considered what is called as the El Nino effect. Since it considered that El Nino will not have any impact, and at the same time the Indian Ocean dipole will also have less of an impact, which is why it was able to come to a conclusion that we will have the normal rainfall during this particular period. Apart from this, the Indian Meteorological Department has come up with a new term called as the monsoon core zone. What is this monsoon core zone? Let's say, for example, there are a number of states in India on the western side, on the eastern side, and on the central area. So these are the regions which comprise what is called as the rain-fed agricultural regions. So because this particular area is very important for the agricultural productivity, those areas which are rain-fed agricultural regions will be called as the monsoon core zone. But the author here also brings into another perspective where he says some of the recommendations given in the past by the Indian Meteorological Department has not been successful. How does he substantiate it? In the year 2019 and in the year 2020, the IMD forecast normal range, but India ended up with 110% and 109% of the long period average, which is why the author says that some of the recommendations or some of these viewpoints given by the IMD might not be actually right, says the author. Why is that these recommendations or some of the suggestions given by the IMD are not successful? That is because of the monsoonal type of climate that India sees, which is unique and its phenomena is unpredictable to predict. That is because when you look into the monsoon season, it is quite unique to India, and at the same time, when you consider the diverse conditions that are present in India, one, we have the cold temperature, one, we have the hot temperature, we have the cold temperatures and the hot deserts as well. We also have the hills and mountains which also influence the monsoon as well. We also have dense population centers, dense forest areas. Because of multiple reasons, what we are not able to accomplish is a particular model for the actual prediction of the rainfall. When you look into the developed countries, in most of the developed countries have what is called as the temperate climates. Let's say for example United States of America, or let's say for example Germany, or let's say for example we are speaking about United Kingdom. Most of these countries have what is called as the temperate climates. When it comes to India, we have mostly tropical climate. Because the tropical climate is hard to predict, the weather conditions are hard to predict, which is why the model that has been imported by the Indian Meteorological Department might be unsuccessful, says the author. One is because of the vast conditions of India, from the north to the south, east to the west, and because of the diverse conditions and the physiological conditions we have, it is tough to predict on one side. And apart from this, when these models that are successful in United States or in any of the developed countries, they might be suitable for the temperate type of climate system, but it might not be successful on the tropical climate system, says the author. So what is the way forward? When it comes to the Indian Meteorological Department, they predict what is called as the normal rainfall, normal monsoon or not. This is basically used for the agriculture, which is why we also discussed about the monsoon core zone as well. Apart from usage of the agriculture, this in the near future will can also be used for the disaster management. So going forward, the author says that apart from the agriculture, we have to effectively make use for the disaster management. This has to be given to the urban areas as well as the rural areas, which is required for their planning, so that all the disaster or flood or any drought like conditions can also be minimized, says the author. Because there are number of industries, number of businesses, number of service sector industries which are now using this particular data, the the Indian Meteorological Department going forward will have to ensure that actual factual data will have to be given to all these industries to make sure that the disasters and other issues are addressed over a period of time. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says implementing green contracts. Let's try and understand what is this concept all about. When it comes to the climate change, what we are witnessing is increasing cases of gas emissions. These gas emissions that countries are making are creating a havoc which is resulting in climate change, and it has also resulted in extreme warming of the earth. In order to ensure that the warming is reduced and we are able to make sure the implications of climate change are reduced, what we require is the gas limitations. That is, the greenhouse emissions that we as countries are doing has to be minimized. Apart from that, what the author suggests is coming up with a contract called as the green contract, where the corporations will have to enter, where the governments will have to enter with number of companies, is what is this article all about. What is the concept of green contracts? Let's say for example a contract is nothing but an obligation between one party and another party, where the contract rules and regulations will have to be met by both the parties. In this particular period, when we are speaking about the green contract, it basically means the contracting parties will have to cut down the greenhouse gas emissions. How do we do it? Let's say for example we have the government of India. Then let's say for example there is one of the companies which is entering into the contract with government of India. So what does the government of India do? The government of India prescribes what is called as the green qualifications that this company or the industry will have to manage. Let's say there is a tender. The tender is for laying of the road approach. So this particular tender is taken by the company after the bidding process. So this particular company which has won the tender will have to meet all the contract rules, or what is called as the green qualifications. What are these green qualifications? It can be the green energy in service delivery, and it also might be on-site waste management as well. What do we mean by green energy? Let's say for example, if we are executing brown energy, where brown energy stands for that which has been extracted from coal, or let's say for example it has been extracted from the non-renewable energy sources, that is what is called as the brown energy. But when it comes to the green energy, it basically means the energy that is taken from the solar, or it can be the wind. So the company employing or given permission by the government should effectively make use of the renewable sources of energy. One is that apart from this, when it comes to this particular contract, they may also give out certain rules and regulations that has to be followed by a particular industry. In case this particular industry does not follow the contract rules, they are liable, or a penal provision can be enforced on them. How? Because there is a green qualification, because the contract rule says that you have to meet such and such criteria, and if they are not able to meet it, then penalties will be imposed on such a company. For example, green energy is to be used by a company. So ideally they should make use of solar energy or the wind energy, but instead of using the green energy, if they are using the coal energy or petroleum energy or from any other non-renewable sources of energy, they might be penalized. How do we ensure that such a company is employing these green qualifications tools? That is where we require what is called as the measurement criteria and the audit of performance of this particular company. Periodically, let's say 6 months or 1 year, there has to be inspection that is conducted, and if there is any violation, such violation of the contract should be borne with damages. This is where it will help in carrying out the sustainable developmental goals, where obligations under this particular process will be binding and would be enforceable in the eyes of law. Parties would be able to cut the emissions, and this will also highlight the non-performance of such obligations. In case a company is violating all the obligations set by the government or by the parties, then in such a case, damages or compensation will have to be borne by that particular organization. So the green contracts is basically nothing but there'll be two parties, not necessarily the government. It can be party A along with party B, where these two companies or the industries enter into a contract that such qualifications will be laid, and all these qualifications will have to be met. So going forward, what we have to realize is that the government has not come up with such a contract. There is no law as such, but when you have industries who can all come together on a voluntary basis, if they are able to improvise and implement the green contracts, that is when we would be able to cut down on the emissions and reduce the global warming, says the author. So it is not only about the economic cost, but we also have to take the environmental cost, because it is the environmental cost which we have failed to consider in number of contracts, says the author. So going forward, it is not only the economic cost, but the environmental cost will also have to be taken into picture by the industries and the government, is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the mains practice questions. The extent and nature of the powers that are available to the election commission is still confusing. Analyze. Next question. What do you understand by green contracts? Explain how their implementation will result in corporations cutting down on emissions. So please write all your answers on the comment section, peer review, and give positive feedback to your fellow aspirant answers. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.